You are listening to the Cognitive Preference Podcast, where we explore the fascinating ways in which our brains process information, make decisions, and perceive the world around us. My name is Robert Brown. I'm here today with Francis Soper, the originator of the Kairos Assessment, which is a series of questions which reveals how your brain prefers to think, listen, observe, move, read, and talk. You can take the assessment at kairoscognition.com to help you better follow along with the show.
There's been a lot of work on what used to be called intelligence. And I say used to be very different, very deliberately. I have no idea what intelligence is or what it means. We'll probably go into that in a lot of detail in the course of this. But there are people who are interested in why it was easier for some people to do some things than others. And one of the first people to think we can test this was a French researcher in this who created what he thought would be a useful test of French soldiers to identify who should be officer candidates. The intention was to create opportunity, because up until that point, you could be an officer if you were born to a noble family. If you came from a certain family, had certain privileges, certain kind of education, that's what allowed you to be an officer. It was your social and family connections, maybe your access to wealth, which is how it worked in monarchies, for example. But then there was a sense that, people who didn't have what they would consider a noble birth actually were very clever and could learn things and do things and could accomplish things. And we're excluding those people. We're not letting those people have higher level positions. So this was a test that was designed to democratize that. And it became the first test of what they called IQ, intelligence quotient. And so those tests defined a lot of the 20th century. They started to separate people by IQ. And some people had high IQ, so therefore they were more intelligent than people who had lower level IQ. And then it's so interesting, so much of this came out of military and warfare. At the end of World War II, higher education, particularly the schools we call the Ivy Leagues, again, weren't exactly taking people from noble or aristocratic families, but they were taking students who had certain levels of opportunity, typically came from families of a certain level of wealth and privilege, which gave them an opportunity to have better schooling or more access to schooling and more access to higher level academic subjects than other students. And those were the students who went from those elite secondary schools into the elite upper schools. So at the end of World War II, all of these soldiers were coming out and the government was funding higher education for veterans. And the president of Harvard at that time, James Bryan Conant, saw that there were all of these very talented individuals who had risen to ranks and success in the Army. And they came from places, communities, and they came from high schools that they wouldn't consider taking students into Harvard from. And so he got the idea of creating a test that might identify those students. So again, it was an attempt to expand. It was a democratic idea to be able to identify people who may not have had the same privileges, but might have these innate abilities. So that was the Scholastic Aptitude Test, or what we call the SAT. And so that had a run for about 40 years. And then a psychologist at Harvard, Howard Gardner, who's still working in the field, in the early 80s, was doing a lot of work on brain research. And what he was doing to start was looking at people who had a traumatic brain injury in some way, so that there was a specific damage to a part of their brain. Either might have been a stroke caused damage to a specific area of the brain, might have been an accident,
concussion, or something like that.
Yeah. And then age-related, he was looking at age-related losses of functions, because there are certain kinds of functions that get lost as we get older, and it's not the same. Some people, and so in doing that, he decided that he recognized actually that the traditional ways we measured intelligence were missing a whole lot of aptitude, a whole lot of ways that people could understand the world, contribute to the world, create and do powerful things out in the world that weren't recognized by the Scholastic Aptitude Test or IQ test. He proposed a theory of multiple intelligences, that we don't have a single intelligence, but we have multiple intelligences, and they manifest in different ways. And so he, at that point, identified 7.
Is that learning styles? Is that the same?
That's interesting, because it developed into the concept of learning styles. Gardner wasn't proposing learning styles. He was proposing that each one of us had this access to these multiple intelligences, and it included linguistics and mathematics, which was tested by most IQ tests and by the Scholastic Aptitude Test. But there was also visual spatial intelligence. There was also what he considered interpersonal intelligence, so the ability to engage with other people and then there was what he called intrapersonal intelligence, which most of us would think of as spiritual. So
this is beyond cognition. This is now we're getting into emotional.
Well, Gardner was doing both cognitive and emotional. He was looking at that we had emotional intelligence, which we now call EQ. And people want to measure that the way they did IQ, right, which I think is going in the wrong direction. But anyway, he was recognizing forms of emotional intelligence and measuring and looking at forms of what we would call cognitive intelligence. And that was an initial hypothesis. And so it was a breakthrough from the traditional, this is what it means to be intelligent. And what's interesting about what Gardner did, I was working I was a young teacher in an elementary school in Cambridge at the time he was doing that work. Now, I was probably 25 when I started teaching. My colleague in the next room, Mary Sheehan, had been teaching for 36 years when I was 25. I could have been one of Mary's students. Mary wouldn't have identified 7 intelligences, but she knew they existed. She, from her experience working with kids, knew about all of this range that students had. And I watched her, with students. We'd be she had 4th grade, I had 3rd grade. We'd often have the kids out in the playground together. And she'd give me these gems of insight into these students across the range. And she wasn't putting them into narrow categories. She was recognizing that these students contained multitudes. They had all of this stuff going on. and different ones of them, had went more easily towards some of them than others, and all of us. It's true. I went more easily to some than others. Mary went more easily to some than others. Our students went more easily to some than others. So when Gardner came out with this, it was these wise people who worked with humans, psychologists, teachers, healthcare professionals, parents, this was Gardner put words around and put an intellectual construct around stuff that wise people had known forever. And what Aristotle knew 4,000 years ago, Alexander, who was his student, had this insight. And one of the famous stories about Alexander is his father, who was the king, Philip, who was the king of Macedonia at that time, which is north of Greece. Philip gave the teenage Alexander a horse that no one had been able to ride. The horse just bucked off anybody who tried it. So it was considered an unbreakable horse. It was a horse that it was too wild to be a horse that anyone could ride. Gave it to Alexander, and Alexander decided he was going to figure out how to ride this horse. Now, one can easily get killed trying to ride a horse that doesn't want to be ridden. But Alexander paid close attention to this horse and realized the horse would get startled by its own shadow, or when the shadow of the rider, or the attempted rider, would come on. So when he first tried to mount the horse, which he named Bucephalus, he had the horse face the sun so that it wouldn't see its shadow, wouldn't see his shadow riding, and he was able to mount it. And Bucephalus and Alexander became inseparable, the way people and horses often become very bonded with each other. And he and Bucephalus did, and he was his horse for years together. But it was that recognition that Bucephalus wasn't an out of control horse. He was an easily startled horse, which is very different. So that kind of wisdom has been available for a long, long time. And what we're trying to do is bring that wisdom into a higher level of understanding.
Having that awareness of, seeing that, okay, this is, maybe I need to look at this horse a little bit differently and try something new instead of just riding along, no pun intended, but like going with the conventional, everybody else is, hopping on the horse any way that they want from any direction, and the horse doesn't have problems. Well, this one does. So there's something wrong with the horse. Well, no, maybe you need to change your approach and have an awareness and perspective that works for both parties. The work that we're trying to do here is to have that awareness and perspective that people operate differently.
And Alexander was a brilliant leader in many other ways, not just keeping a horse from turning into a horse meat stew, but he brought that insight into many fields.
Thank you for tuning in today to listen to our show. If you find value in these episodes, consider sharing this with a friend, a colleague, or a family member that you think will benefit. See you in the next episode.